So I've given this argument that seems to suggest that the common sense view of ethical careers and how to do good in the world through your career is wrong. It's made some mistakes along the way. So we might wonder, why have we made these mistakes? And I think the answer can be summed up in this slogan that often gets used of making a difference. I think that represents a failure to quantify. It represents thinking about these things in terms of what careers can make me feel good, or what careers, have all the trappings of seeming like they're doing something really good. And it fails to take into account the vast discrepancy of impact that one can have by pursuing different careers. So like I say, we focus on making a difference rather than making the most difference. And that requires a bit of research, it requires a bit of reflection, because it's unintuitive. I mean, I'm really sympathetic to this idea that, well, if you want to benefit people, you should be going there and helping them. Isn't that the most natural thought in the world? And I think it would make a lot of sense if we were in a perfect world. Unfortunately, we're not in a perfect world. We live in a world where the income distribution is so radically unequal that our money becomes the most important resource that we have. I'll show you this. This is the world income distribution. If you've been to Given What We Can talks before, you might be familiar with it. And as you can see, it's just vastly skewed in favour of the very rich. So if this was a completely equal distribution, it would just be a linear relationship. It would just be a straight line.
Actually, it'd be horizontal.
Oh, would it be horizontal? Yeah. Thank you, Toby. Always picks up the mathematical errors. Now, I think all of you will be in the top 2% richest of the world's population. If you earn above £20,000, for example, you're in the richest 1.5%. If you earn over and above £25,000 a year, you're in the richest 1%. But the curve just keeps on going. And it's true that by putting yourself in this tiny part of the world income distribution, which is something that most of us have the opportunity to do in virtue of being students at Oxford, you're able to redistribute wealth from the very top to the very bottom, to the people living on less than $1.25 a day. And that can do huge amounts of good. And this partly explains why it's so counterintuitive. We live in a world that's just completely non-ideal. It's completely messed up. And for that reason, our natural instincts can lead us astray. So the models that go in with your gut, relying on heuristics that are common, like do what you're good at, it just isn't enough. Choosing the right career is going to be counterintuitive. It requires research and reflection. And this is simply because the magnitude of global inequality is so great, and that therefore means that the magnitude of the amount of impact you can do by pursuing different careers is so great. So I presented this in a Debbie Downer sort of way, but it also shows that it's an opportunity. In a perfect world, you wouldn't have this opportunity to make a huge and lasting impact in the world. You wouldn't have this opportunity to help save thousands of lives. So the fact that we're in an imperfect world should be empowering, in fact. It should give us cause to change it. Okay, and then the final reason, I think, perhaps why we make these mistakes about thinking about correct career choice is to do with the idea of martyrdom. We assume perhaps that doing good must involve self-sacrifice. And again, I think maybe in a perfect world it would. If you wanted to help more people, you just have to work more. And similarly in the kind of paradigm examples of kind of ethical behavior where you're just relating to one other person, then often self-sacrifice is required. If you want to help other people, you need to put yourself out. But again, we live in this crazy world, and it's just not the case. Supposing the altruistic banker, so supposing firstly that she's like the majority of the population and desires the things that money can buy. I'm not so sympathetic to this. I'm pretty happy as it is, and I would get additional happiness from additional income, but not that much. But other people certainly if you give them a prospect of earning a six-figure salary, they'd be pretty pleased with that. And it's true that the altruistic banker, suppose she earns £6 million over a 30-year career, which is perfectly feasible. If so, she could save 10,000 lives while still having an average salary of £100,000 a year. If she'd gone into NGO work, this is more than she'd ever get paid, and that's her average. And given the marginal benefit issue, it seems likely that she's doing more good as well. So simply noting the fact that martyrdom and how much good you do are logically independent, there's no reason why you should think they're correlated. And it seems like if you want, you can do huge amounts of good and still have a high-flying lifestyle. Of course, you can do probably even more good if you martyr yourself a little bit more. But it's important to realize there's this result if you don't want to go all out. So the final thing that I'm sure is on everyone's mind about what could support this standard view is the idea that an ethical career is one that doesn't cause harm, whereas non-ethical careers do cause harm. And that's what's morally relevant. What you really want to be doing is not causing harm. So I'm sympathetic to this objection. It's obviously got the best of intentions. You're wanting to do the right thing, and you're just really worried about hurting people. And of course that's relevant. I wouldn't recommend a career if it was going to do more harm than good. But there are a few considerations, I think, that need to be borne in mind. The first is that causing harm is an inevitable part of many careers, including working as a doctor or for an NGO. So what we can't have is simply a prohibition against causing any sort of harm at all. We can't just divide careers into the categories of, well, in this career I'll do some amount of harm at some point in my life, whereas in this other career I won't, so I'll go for this. Rather, we've got to be a bit more sophisticated about it. Because even as a doctor, sometimes you'll be hungover, you'll perform an operation badly. In the course of your life, you'll be performing an awful lot of operations. You're not always going to perform perfectly. Sometimes people will die as a result of your actions. And it will be the case that you could have acted otherwise and not such that they wouldn't have died. Similarly, if you were working for an NGO, if you're working for a development charity in the developing world, sometimes you'll make mistakes. You'll choose a course of action that you'll see in retrospect was wrong, and people will lose their lives foreseeably as a result. This isn't to impugn these careers, it's simply to say that any career involves some amount of harm, or at least almost any career. And all that's to show is that we simply can't have this absolute prohibition against doing harm. We've got to take into account the fact that you do so much good as well. The second reason is that it seems like the amount of harm you do is negligible in some high-impact careers, at least. So Ben will give you a wide variety of careers that are potentially very high impact. Some do very little benefit, so investment, management consultancy, accountancy, or becoming an actuary. It's possible there's zero sum. It's possible, in fact, they don't really benefit society at all. They just move money among the rich people. Maybe they do some amount of benefit. But it's not clear that they do harm. You're helping wealthy individuals to invest as well as they can in the case of investment. Management consultancy, you're trying to make businesses more efficient. Accountancy, you're simply making people's finances more efficient. And it's not clear that these are directly harming people. So if this is a real consideration in your mind, then that doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue a high-impact career. It means you just need to think a little bit about which one to pursue. The final reason, though, which I think is the most interesting, is again considering this idea of what would have happened had you not acted as you did. So let's take a kind of paradigmatically evil corporation. Let's take a petrochemical company. And we'll just have a toy example where we suppose that the typical manager in a petrochemical company causes 10 deaths through his contribution to anthropogenic climate change. So we've got these little clone children again, and now we've got the Grim Reaper visiting each of their pets. So again, of course, I'm not saying that the typical petrochemical manager actually causes 10 deaths. This is just an example. But now suppose that you decide to go into this career. Say it's really highly paid, which it is. The fact that you're altruistically minded will very likely mean that you cause less harm. You do less things that actively cause the harms of people than the typical manager. Perhaps you can avoid the very most egregious policy decisions. Perhaps you can guide the company towards investing more in renewable energies. So even though you've still got to do a lot of dirty work, after all, you're working for a petrochemical company, you'll do less than the typical manager of this company, who would be sitting in his chair, stroking his cat, and devising ways in which to punish the developing world a little bit more. If there's any petrochemical company managers here, change job. Get better and give the money away. So, as a result of you going and becoming this petrochemical manager rather than someone else, it's actually the case that, in this toy example, 2 lives have been saved. So again, the number isn't what matters. The point is that, in virtue of you occupying this position rather than the typical petrochemical company manager, that corporation has done less harm. And so, in fact, you've actually benefited people. And that was independent of the reason that you actually went into this career, which was to make money and give it away. It's kind of like a bonus. So the moral is simply that high-impact careers needn't also involve harming people. And that, in fact, working for evil corporations can be a way of benefiting the world. So, okay, before I move on to Ben, give him the talk, I'll just quickly summarize the models, which is that benefiting indirectly can do much more good than directly benefiting. For example, by earning big and donating. Ben will give some other suggestions. The second, which I suggested was the most important, was don't be replaceable. You've got to do something that wouldn't have otherwise happened. If you go into a career such that everything you do, all the benefit you do, would have happened anyway, you've done no good. If you pursue a career according to which if someone else had been in your place, they'd have done the same thing except better, then you've actually harmed the world. But similarly, if you go and do something and generate a certain amount of benefit, and none of that benefit would have happened anyway, then you can truly make a vast impact on the world. Then I went through 3 possible explanations of why we make these mistakes in the kind of common sense view of thinking about ethical careers. Failure to quantify, or thinking with your gut, thinking in terms of martyrdom, and thinking ethical career must be one that involves sacrifice, and finally, misunderstanding harm, or thinking that any career which is high impact in the sense that we're talking about must also harm the world. And so now I'll move on to part 2. As I said, my talk was a bit of a downer, it was a bit negative, it was a bit critical, whereas Ben is going to give us the positive side of things.